In this video, we're actually going to talk about jig fishing rod, reel, and line configurations. This is kind of going to be a continuation of the video that I did yesterday. Yesterday, I talked about why you may not be getting bit on jigs. Today is all about the combos. I had kind of talked about it yesterday. I said I wanted to make just a full video on this, and the reason being is that there's kind of a lot when it comes to a jig. It really depends on how you fish it, really with what combo that I go with. Now, with all that being said, I do have one combo, the one that I'm holding right here, that if I could only pick out one to use for every type of jig fishing, it would be this one right here. So we're going to talk about this combo, but I'm also going to talk about just a few considerations that you may want to think about when it comes to fishing a jig on your specific bodies of water. Now, before we talk about the combo, this video is brought to you by Fin Fishing Apparel. And guys, I decided to do a contest and a flash sale for the next like 4 or 5 days. So basically over on the website right now, the Fin Fishing website, if you use the coupon code BFHQ, you can get 15% off any product, whether that's shorts, the USA made sun shirts, hats, whatever it may be, 15% off. Also, I am going to pick out 10 random winners over the next 4 or 5 days to put in your package a number of different things. So 8 of you is going to receive basically a variety pack of warrior baits. I had some of these left over. So 8 of you are going to get 5 different packs of warrior baits. I think that's a $30 value in itself. And 2 of you will actually get these Berkley Nessie baits. So I'm giving away 10 different prizes. Also, you can sign up for the contest for free. If you go to the middle section of the homepage, there is a newsletter sign up. Sign up for the newsletter. You can also get kind of an entry into this contest. But anyways, I'm gonna leave some links down below in the description for fin fishing. As you guys know, it truly helps support this channel. All right, let's talk a little bit about jig fishing. Now, like I talked about in yesterday's video, there are so many different ways that you can fish a jig. It is what makes a jig such a good bait. It truly is, to me, the best bait out there on the market. It catches a lot of them. It catches big ones. But because there are so many different ways that you can fish a jig and then so many different types of cover, there are a lot of different rod and reel lengths, line configurations that you really need to kind of think about when it comes to fishing a jig, because it all kind of varies. Now, the first thing that I will say that doesn't change, no matter what rod that I end up going with my jig fishing, is the action of the rod. The action of the rod, to me, almost all the time is going to be a fast action rod, meaning that about the top 20 to 30%, usually about 30% is going to be your give, and the rest of it, that 70%, is going to be backbone. Now, a jig, all jigs out there on the market are single hooked jigs. Actually, there are some double hooked jigs, but it doesn't really make a difference. A single hook jig, that is the type of action that I like. Now, depending on the size of the jig, it really depends on kind of the power of the jig that I go with. You know, if I am fishing most jigs that are between about a 1/4 ounce and I would say probably about 5/8 of an ounce, I feel like a medium heavy rod is pretty much, you're good to go with that. If I'm fishing a really big jig, you know, if I'm flipping a jig into heavy cover, maybe it's really thick lily pads, maybe I'm fishing for a 7, 8, 9, 10 pounder down in Florida, Texas, although I've never been to Texas. In that situation, the medium heavy is going to be a little bit light for a 1 ounce jig. So I may want something that is actually a heavy power, although again, fast action. So just remember that if you're looking for a jig rod, you have to think about the jig fishing that you specifically are going to be doing most of the time. Now, the other thing that you want to kind of think about is, again, what kind of jig fishing are you doing? Are you primarily doing a lot of flips and pitches in small casts, or are you making long bomb casts out there? Because, for example, when I fish a football jig, I typically am fishing a jig that I am casting out there a long ways and dragging it across the bottom. So when I fish a football jig, I tend to like a longer rod to help me not only with casting a long distance, but also getting a good hook set at that long distance. But if you are fishing in really tight quarters, maybe you're pitching and skipping a jig up underneath overhanging trees into a dock, you don't necessarily need that length. So that's something that just you always need to think about, because typically if you're pitching a lot, you can obviously pitch with a 7'6", you can pitch with an 8-foot rod. It's just a little bit more in your hand to kind of think about. I personally like, if I'm doing a lot of pitching, kind of that 7'2", 7'3" range. So that is why there are so many different things to think about when it comes to a jig. The other thing to think about is the cover that you are fishing. There are times where I'm going to use a jig on straight braid. There are times where I'm going to use a jig on fluorocarbon. There's even times where I'm going to use a jig on a braid to fluorocarbon, right? There's so many different configurations. It all impacts your rod as well. So now let's actually talk about the one rod that I would go with. And honestly, it's kind of two rods. These rods are both ARC fishing rods. As you guys know, always you can use the coupon code BFHQ and get 10% off any ARC rods, whether that is reels or rods or even their lures. You can get 10% off BFHQ10 over on the website. Just remember that. But anyways, these two rods are different series of rods, but they are basically the exact same rod. And these are the ones that are like my go-to all-around jig rod. If I could pick out one jig rod for the rest of my life, I would go with either one of these. These are both great rods. They're in a little bit different price ranges. The Tharp series is that $129 range, and I believe the Essence is, I can't now remember if it's $159 or $179. It's somewhere, it's a little bit more expensive. They also have different handles. You know, the Moneymaker rod, which we'll talk about here in a minute, has that EVA, where this is more the cork grip. Also, side note, am I the only one who like leaves their plastic wraps on their rods like for as long as possible? Like, I don't know what it is. I've done that with every rod that I've ever owned. I just leave it on there until it like comes off, basically. I don't know. Maybe I'm just weird. But anyways, if you look at the back of these rods, this is the ARC Tharp Series Moneymaker rod. As you can see, I also use this for frogs. I've also used this one for frogs. This is also a great like mag draft. Both of these rods are great mag draft rods. Or kind of that like 6-inch style swim bait. Even a Berkeley Nessie like this would be a really great rod option too. But anyways, these rods are almost the exact same. 7-foot 3-inch fast action rods, like we talked about. This is a medium heavy, where this is what they call a mag medium heavy. But they honestly are rated for the exact same line, which is 12 to 20 pound. And the lure weight is still the same, which is 1/4 to 1 ounce. So these are basically the same rods. These are the rods that I would recommend if you needed just one. Also, when it comes to jig fishing, I like a high gear ratio reel. I like something that is an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio reel. This one is actually, the one that's in my hand right here is a 7.1. That's because I use this primarily for my mag drafts. But this, I like an 8.1. You like a high gear ratio reel when it comes to fishing a jig. Now again, line can really change depending on the cover that you are fishing and the style that you are fishing. I will say that a lot of the time when I am fishing a jig, like a football jig, I like 16 pound, 17 pound fluorocarbon for making a long cast. If I'm fishing a finessier jig, like a 1/4 ounce jig, I like something in the 12 to 15 pound fluorocarbon. And the biggest reason is that when you're using really light jigs, if you use too heavy a line, you could absolutely get away with it, especially if you're fishing a little bit shallow water. But a lot of times when I'm using a 1/4 ounce jig personally, I am doing a lot of casting to the bank, and maybe, for example, like I use a 1/4 ounce jig a lot in cold water when the bass want that slow fall rate. And a lot of times what I'm doing is fishing creek channel swing banks, or even on the bottom in like a pond. I fished a 1/4 ounce jig a lot, where I'm going to cast that bait out and I'm just going to lift it up and let it fall. And when you are fishing, there's a huge difference between fishing a 12 or 15 pound fluorocarbon and a 20, because cold 20 pound line is just a lot for a 1/4 ounce jig, where you have a better feel for that, and the bait can just kind of move a little bit more freely with that 12 to 15 pound. So the other thing though, if I'm fishing around a lot of vegetation, you can get away with straight braid at times. I'm a guy who primarily fishes straight braid with my swim jigs. No matter the situation, no matter the cover, I like straight braid in that. And, you know, there are times where I do like a braid to fluorocarbon. And so that is primarily when I am fishing in really tall grass, which we've talked about that technique a little bit before. But when I'm fishing like really tall grass, you know, up in the northern part of the country, we have a lot of grass that is 8 and 9, even 12, 14 foot tall. Milfoil does this. There's certain types of Elodea or hydrilla that does this. There's coontail that gets to be 8, 9 foot tall. And those bass will position around it. I really like a braid to fluorocarbon in that situation. Just because a lot of times in the north you're dealing, even in the south, you have hydrilla lakes that are really clear. You're dealing with really clear water at times, but I like to have the braid to rip through that grass. So that there's just so many different things to think about, and I hate that, because the only thing I like to make things simple in bass fishing, but because you can fish a jig in so many different ways, that is what makes things difficult. Now, if I were to pick out one line, I would probably go with like 17. 17-pound fluorocarbon would probably be okay for all around jig fishing. It may be a little bit light if you are pitching into really heavy cover, where I'm gonna like that 20-pound fluoro. But that's probably a good all around, hey Ty, I can have one jig set up, probably like 16, 17-pound fluorocarbon, and an 8.191 gear ratio reel and one of these rods. So I will have stuff linked down below in the description if you guys are looking for the specific rod or specific reel that I have held up, but that's probably what I would go with jig fishing. So sorry that was a little bit long video. There's just so much little nuances within the jig fishing world. There's so many different ways to fish it that I thought it needed a whole separate video. Hopefully I cleared some of that up for you guys. But anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, and I will see you guys tomorrow.